It is my pleasure to now introduce this year's keynote speaker, Mr. Dennis Ross. All of you graduates here today have something in common with Mr. Ross. You're all graduating with a BA in political science. Mr. Ross got his start right here at UCLA, completing both his undergraduate and graduate degrees. Mr. Ross is also a recipient of UCLA's highest medal and has been named UCLA Alumnus of the Year. In 2011, Mr. Ross rejoined the Washington Institute for Near East Policy as a counselor. From 2001 to 2009, Mr. Ross served as the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow and as a counselor at the Institute. Mr. Ross later served as a special assistant to President Obama, as a National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and served a year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Prior to 2001 and his time spent at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Mr. Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process. During the George H.W. Bush administration, Mr. Ross served as director of the State Department's policy planning staff, in which he played a prominent role in U.S. policy toward the former Soviet Union, the unification of Germany and its integration into NATO, arms control negotiations, and the 1991 Gulf War coalition. Under President Clinton's administration, Mr. Ross served as a special Middle East coordinator. He was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 Interim Agreement. He also successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord and facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty. Mr. Ross was awarded the Presidential Medal for Distinguished Federal Civilian Service by President Clinton. We are honored to have such a successful fellow Bruin and political scientist with us today. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Dennis Ross.
Thank you. Congratulations. I have to tell you that it's actually very hard for me to believe that 43 years ago, I was in your position. I graduated, I was a major in political science, and that was a really long time ago. It was a very different era, if you think about it. Now, this is going to be a little bit painful for me to say, not for me, but for you to hear. When I was here, the relationship between the state of California and the university was just a little bit different. We paid no tuition. We paid fees. Another sign of how different the era was, I was looking around for the banners. I see the volleyball, but I don't see the basketball. When I was here, we actually won every year. Now, I want you to understand something. That era will probably never happen again for anybody. But I was here not only as an undergraduate, but as a graduate for 8 of the championships. You get spoiled when that's the case. But when I was here, it was also a very turbulent time. You know, the spring quarter of my last year, the spring of 1970, was the time of Kent State. It was the time of the Cambodian incursion. For students all around the country, including me, that looked like it was an expansion of the Vietnam War, not its ending of the Vietnam War. Students at Kent State were actually killed in protest, and the whole university atmosphere, including here at UCLA, was not only electric, it erupted in protest and demonstrations. So much so that Governor Reagan actually closed the university for a week. Now, that was not the era of 24/7 news. So I was on campus, ever vigilant, ever studying. Actually not at that time, since we didn't have classes. But I was on campus, and the campus had been closed, but I didn't know it. We actually had National Guardsmen with rifles and tops of buildings, and suddenly out of nowhere, we had police formations appear and declare that anybody who was on the campus was taking part in an illegal assembly. At the time, as I said, I was by what was then known as the Gypsy Wagon, which I think has long since disappeared. It's at the base of Bruin Walk. And I was with a group of students, and suddenly one of them, not me, yelled at the police. The next thing I knew, this formation of police in riot gear were running after us. Now, this is a memorable moment in my experience. I can actually tell you that had there been a stopwatch on me, Usain Bolt would not be the world's fastest human. I took off, didn't turn around until I crossed Gailey Avenue on the way to Glen Rock, and I'm here today. After I graduated, I went and I worked for 2 years in the McGovern presidential campaign. And at the end of that experience, I said, all right, enough of politics. I'm going to develop a policy expertise, and I came back to UCLA. I ended up writing a dissertation on Soviet decision-making. At the time, the Soviet Union was the focal point of all national security. It was what guided and organized our approach to foreign policy. If you had an interest in a region of the world, and I also had an interest in the Middle East, everything was somehow seen through that prism. Now think about it. In 1970, I could not have imagined when I graduated that the Soviet Union in 21 years would no longer exist. I want you to think about, as you look ahead, as you sit here, what in the next 5, 10, 20 years will also no longer exist, and it would be a surprise to you today if in fact you thought about it and you became aware that it wasn't going to exist any longer. Right now you hear a lot about cybersecurity. You know, a few years ago you didn't. A few years from now, if there are military conflicts, cyber may play the central role in military conflicts. Something that could not have been imagined, as I said, a short while ago. 2 years ago, Hosni Mubarak was the president of Egypt. Today, he sits in a jail cell. 2 years ago, nobody predicted that you would see the upheaval in the Middle East. Even now, the map of the Middle East might be something that a few years from now, we might have to think about in entirely different terms. I want to tell you a little story. In 2007, I was asked by Vanity Fair to collaborate with them on a look that they were taking at T.E. Lawrence's map that he had proposed to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. T.E. Lawrence was better known as Lawrence of Arabia. He prepared a map for the Paris Peace Conference that was designed to show what he thought the Middle East should look like. He didn't want it to be shaped by, in his mind, British and French colonial interests. He thought the states that were going to emerge in the Middle East after the First World War should reflect a set of premises. It should be guided by the sectarian identities, the tribal identities, the clannish identities, and states should be built around that. So if you visualize the Persian Gulf and you look down the Western Rim, Shia from Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, they would make up a state. Or if you're looking at northern Iran, northern Iraq, or what today is northeastern Syria, the Kurds should make up a state. Or in central Saudi Arabia, looking to the south, particular Sunni tribes should make up a state. Or to the western part of Saudi Arabia, in the Hejaz, in Mecca, Medina, up into what's now Jordan, those tribes should make up a state. Or in what was then Palestine, the Jewish presence should make up a state. Or what is in Lebanon, around Mount Lebanon, where the Maronite Christians were, that should be a state. I was asked by Vanity Fair, do you think that map makes sense for the Middle East? And in 2007, my imagination wasn't rich enough. And I said, no, I can't conceive of that. Now, if I were asked that question today, what do you think my answer would be? It's a rhetorical question. It would be very different. Today, the country we call Syria may never exist again. President Obama has made a decision to provide lethal assistance. This is a country that is consumed by a war. It is a country where before the beginning of this war, there were 21 million people. Today, more than half of the 21 million have been displaced. Around 100,000 have probably been killed. It's a moral catastrophe. But it's not only a moral catastrophe. Every country that borders Syria is being affected by it. You know, I often say about Syria that the Las Vegas rules don't apply. What takes place in Syria isn't going to stay in Syria. There's a tradition, for those of you who have studied American foreign policy, there's a tradition of having two different schools of thought. One school of thought is an idealist school of thought. The other is a realist school of thought. The idealists think that we should only intervene in those places where we have a compelling moral interest, a humanitarian interest. The realists think we should never intervene except where we have strategic interests, oil or tangible interests that involve our credibility. If you think about Syria, here's a place where there's a moral imperative and there's a strategic imperative. Very rarely do you see the idealists and the realists agree on anything. They may agree on Syria. The only thing I can tell you for sure about Syria, it's a conflict that is not going to end soon. Think about the world that you're going to be facing. You're going to be facing a world where these kinds of conflicts are going to continue to be the case. They reflect the most basic, fundamental, atavistic instincts in human nature. They're all about conflicts over identity. At the same time, you're going to face a world where change takes place. Lynn talked about big data. You talked about, in effect, the pace of change, of innovation. We're going to face, you're going to face, you, the class of 2013, are going to face a world where, on the one hand, the pace of change, of technological development, of innovation, the role of data, all of that is going to progress very quickly. And at the same time, you're going to have these continuing conflicts that are characterized by these basic instincts. You're going to have conflicts that shape an international reality that produces great uncertainty. Anybody who tells you they know exactly what the Middle East is going to look like in 5 years, don't believe them. So you're entering a world that is going to be characterized by change, uncertainty, and unknowns. And as you do your analysis as political science graduates, some of you will go into the public sector, others will go into the private sector, but you're all going to have to do analysis of one form or another. And there's a few key principles that ought to guide you as you do it. The first, given the kind of world I've described, is humility. You should have a high dose of humility. You shouldn't fall in love with your own ideas. You should understand, because of the uncertainty, that as you do your analysis, you should think about it, but be humble in terms of how you approach it. The second principle you ought to have in mind is you ought to be self-critical. You constantly be asking yourself, what are my key assumptions? And how is reality affecting those assumptions? Is it validating those assumptions? Is it invalidating those assumptions? Does it fortify them? And the third principle you should have in mind is you need to be flexible. You need to be adaptable. You need to be able to adjust. And above all else, you need to be able to express yourself clearly, whether in the written form or in verbal form. Now, the good news for all of you, you're graduates of UCLA. You learned how to think. You learned how to think critically. You learned how to analyze. You learned how to evaluate choices. You learned how to express yourself. All the traits, all the attributes that you're going to need to be successful in this world of change and uncertainty. What I hope for you is not just that you have the ability to analyze. What I hope for you is that you will all have a life of meaning. What I hope for you is you'll all have a sense of purpose. Jennifer talked about having a passion. I hope that all of you will have a passion in life other than yourselves. That will give you a sense of meaning. You know, we are in this November will be the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were the people who inspired me to go into public service. Maybe President Obama will inspire many of you. Maybe for those of you who have more of a Republican instinct, maybe you listened to Marco Rubio's recent speech this week on immigration. Maybe you'll be inspired by those who think that public service is a good calling. I think it's a noble calling. But whether you choose public service or whether you go into the private sector, find a cause, find a program, do something that engages your passion other than the career that you choose. If you do it, you'll have a life of meaning. If you do it, you'll have a sense of fulfillment. If you do it, you will have taken full advantage of what UCLA has to offer. Good luck, congratulations, thank you, and go Bruins.